Right, Talmudim Way. Gospel backgrounds number 23. This is all of John chapter 6, and it's a lengthy chapter, so we're going to have to split it up into two parts. So this is the Bread of Life, part 1. We always want to start with Acts 17:11, and in this lesson, we can have some fun comparing the same accounts in all four Gospels. Each one, particularly with the feeding of the 5,000, has a little bit different angle and things that the author wants us to note and describes to us. So we'll check into that a little bit. So our topics for part 1: the feeding of the 5,000, the miracle from the 5 loaves and 2 fish that Jesus brings about for the multitude here. There are some parallels with Moses, and it's actually the first of his ministry events that's addressed in all four Gospels, and each Gospel writer attacks it a little bit differently. Then right after that, this miracle brings him some instant popularity, and the crowd then wants to make him king. And I saw this line in a commentary: "Free food and a political king, right? Who doesn't want that, right?" Got news for you: he's not the Messiah you're looking for. And then that leads to sort of he sends the disciples off, and then he goes in a different direction, and then that leads into the walking on water. That's a very famous miracle that Jesus performed. And then next lesson, John will continue following up on both of these miracles in what's known as the bread of life discourse. So he says, "I am the bread of life," and then he actually goes into, "I'm not the Messiah you're looking for," kind of thing. It's interesting as we get into that. We'll compare and contrast the Samaritan's reaction to living water versus the bread of life, where he's rejected. And at the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 6, the disciples will say, "This is a hard teaching," and we'll see a lot of them dispersed because they just can't handle it. Robertson, who puts the Gospel harmony together that we're using, he says the collapse of the Galilean campaign, this leads to the collapse of the Galilean campaign because Jesus will not conform to popular messianic expectation. All right, let's look at our geography here. So we have Bethsaida, which is here, and then Luke records that the feeding of the 5,000 is somewhere near or adjacent to Bethsaida. So a lot of scholars believe it is down in this area where box 7, and yet some scholars believe it was off to the west. So just as a kind of a geographical reminder, you have the Jordan River here that really divided the area of Bethsaida from the area of Capernaum. So Capernaum would have been ruled by Herod Antipas. Bethsaida was actually under the jurisdiction of Herod Philip. So you actually had two different rulers. And then you had sort of down here, you had this region that was known as the Decapolis, and they were really self-supporting. So when it says to the other side, it usually means sailing from Capernaum off to the Decapolis, but it really could mean any of these 3 areas here. So let's just assume box 7 is where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. Then the crowd is numerous and they want to make him king. So Jesus sends his disciples off on a boat, and Mark says they're actually sailing back towards Bethsaida, which is not too hard to, even though it's in the same region. I mean, they could have gotten in the boat right here and then gone up that way. But then they meet the storm, and the storm kind of throws them off course, and that's where Jesus walks on water. And then immediately after that, that's box 8, and then immediately after that, they end up in Gennesaret, where then it's added that the sick were healed in Mark 6:53. So there's that, and then the next section in John is that we're in Capernaum, really for the remainder of the chapter, and he will give verses 25, 26 through the end of the chapter from the synagogue at Capernaum. So we're journeying all around here, some on land and some on sea. So lots of adventures here. I'll read the John version, but in this one in particular, I would encourage you to read the parallel passages. They're really interesting, where they line up and where they go their separate ways, if you will. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following them because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And then this is where Luke says they withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. We need to remember that in the Matthew account, this has Jesus retreating immediately after he hears the news that John the Baptist has been executed. So we presume from that he's taking some time to mourn. In the Mark account and in the Luke account, they have this sort of mini retreat as after the apostles had returned from their Galilean missionary journey. And so they were basically, Jesus was getting a debriefing from that lesson. And then John has this happening immediately after the healing at the pools of Bethesda, which is down in Jerusalem. And don't confuse Bethesda with Bethsaida, which is in Galilee, which is where this miracle is going to happen. So Luke 9 verse 10 indicates Jesus was somewhere in the vicinity of Bethesda. This is a traditional, basically a scholar's estimate of where the feeding of the 5,000 might have taken place. Obviously, we don't know for sure. And from our vantage point, so many miles away and so many thousands of years later, it really doesn't matter all that much. But it is interesting when you see the geography of the land could be conducive to a very, very large crowd. In the geographic commentary on the Gospels, Franz is the author, and he says there's really no consensus on where the feeding took place. He is the scholar I reference that actually has the feeding west of Bethsaida, more towards Capernaum, but a lot of scholars have it towards the east. So this is the plain of Bethsaida. I'm gonna tongue tie that myself. Bethsaida, and you can see it just very sloping. It's a high point, but it's kind of easy to picture Jesus going up on this hill, either to retreat or to teach, and that's where he does the miracle. So the hill, Bolin notes that the hill that Jesus climbed is probably one of these in the foreground that is on the eastern side of the plain of Bethsaida. Mark records that by the time the boat had landed, there was already a crowd gathered. So possibly they had heard the apostles' teaching and healing ministry, and a number of them had followed each pair of apostles back towards the Sea of Galilee, and then they all kind of converged. So that kind of can contribute to this large crowd here. Now the Passover, the feast of the Judaioi, was at hand, the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" So again, we have John, the gospel writer, documented this is the Passover, the feast of the Jews, or as we like to say, the Judaioi, because there are other groups that celebrate Passover, and this is a picture of the modern Samaritans. You can see by the period piece Adidas hat there, not from 2,000 years ago, but from more recent. But they still observe the Passover today, and so there's the Passover of the Jews was on one calendar, and then the other groups had a different Passover. We don't really know why John makes a reference to the Passover, other than some speculations. It appears to tell us the time of year. This was the springtime. Mark actually does the same thing. He'll say that they rested on the green grass, which we'll see in the next section of scripture here. The hills are green in the spring, kind of like they are in Texas because of the rain, but when the dry season hits, like they do here, our grass turns brown, and if we didn't have irrigation, then our hillsides will be brown, just like Galilee is. So when we put it all together, basically we can also deduce this is the beginning of Jesus' final year. If we hold to a crucifixion date of AD 30, then this is precisely 1 year earlier in AD 29, because in Passover, a year from now, whatever date we hold is when Jesus' final days will be. Lancaster, in his commentary, sees a connection between the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, of which 12 baskets were left over, and Jesus' last meal that were held among his 12 disciples. So there may be a connection there. So John comments that Jesus said this to test Philip, which is interesting. What sort of test was this, and did Philip pass or fail? Practically, Jesus may have asked Philip this because Philip was from Bethsaida, and he would have most been aware of where one could go by bread. But larger, this appears to be a test of faith, which Philip did not pass. Because a few months ago, Lancaster connects the dots that Jesus taught his disciples to consider the birds that the Heavenly Father feeds. And so the thought is Philip saw the size of the crowd and faltered, forgetting who he was with and that Jesus was very much able to feed them. 200 denarii would have been, so a denarii is like a wage earner's daily wage, and so 200 days worth of wages would not only have bought very little for the crowd there. So it's important to note that the disciples were definitely a work in progress, and so are we, right? Our faith is tested, maybe not quite directly as Philip's was here, but we're still looking for opportunities to grow and to trust him more every day. So barley loaves and fish, and this is a dish that is served along the Sea of Galilee. It's called St. Peter's fish, and that's in reference to the miracle of the fish with the silver coin in its mouth, where Peter reaches down and has the fish that pays the tax. We'll see that in a few lessons. So one fish along with some pita might make a meal for one person, but the barley loaves that the boy brought were probably quite small to begin with, not all that nourishing. And the fish were likely, smaller, like sardines almost. So very much understating the need, the contrasting the meager portions that they appear to have versus the size of the crowd. Lots of commentators try to make guesses at what the 5 loaves and 2 fish mean, and then ultimately the 12 baskets. 12 baskets we're more confident about that represents Israel, the 12 tribes, and then the 12 apostles who will judge the 12 tribes. But really anything regarding the 5 loaves and 2 fish is more speculative. Lancaster in his commentary notes that from a Jewish perspective, the Torah is often associated with bread. The verse that Jesus quoted, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word from the mouth of God, and the words of God are recorded in the Torah. So this could be the 5 books of the Torah, which were broken up and sent out to the masses, or Lancaster says they might intend no symbolism whatsoever. One location that I didn't mention is in Tagba. And Tagba is a great place to visit, but this is the location of the restoration of Peter in John 21, traditionally, and it's the traditional location of the calling of the disciples initially. And probably because it was just convenient for pilgrims, it also became known as the place of the feeding of the 5,000. This does not appear to be geographically accurate because it's nowhere near Bethsaida. So we got a problem there. This is a really cool mosaic. The slight problem is that there are no fish in the Sea of Galilee that have 2 dorsal fins, so commentators will kind of nitpick that. And again, it was because it was sanctified by the memory of Jesus and the 12 versus the other events, reference to the other events that happened here. This probably just became a convenient pilgrim stop, but it's not the right location. Verse 10, Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, and this is where Mark says green grass. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and so also the fish, as much as they wanted. So a lot of notes on this section. The word for sit down here is actually, it implies reclining, as if you would do at a formal banquet. So Lancaster sees this as a foreshadow of the Messianic banquet at the table of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in the kingdom of heaven, which we read about in Matthew 8. And then we would also refer to this as the marriage supper of the Lamb, which we read about in Revelation. It's also interesting that Mark records he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and then John says he had given thanks, and then the other gospels say something similar. It was pointed out to me by my friend Izzy Abraham that in Judaism we don't bless the food, we bless the one who gave us the food. You don't thank the food, you thank the one who gave you the food. There's a problem in the NASB translates Mark 6:41 as he looked up to heaven and blessed it, meaning blessed the food. Really, the Greek is more like looked up to heaven, he blessed, without an object there. So this, to me, brings up an interesting point about tradition. So here, Jesus is clearly following a tradition. Strictly speaking, in Deuteronomy 8, we're to bless God after we have eaten and after we're satisfied. Blessing God before eating had already become a custom that indeed many of us follow today. But I think a lot of in our Christian circles we bless the food, but that's really equivalent to blessing the creation. And so maybe let's stop doing that and bless God, who's the creator, instead. So anyway, when you encounter the philosophy that says Jesus came to do away with traditions of men, not in this case he didn't, because this was clearly a tradition. There's actually a very specific blessing that is given for bread in Hebrew that is used to this day. And there's actually no reason to think that Jesus wouldn't have said this blessing or something very like it back here in the first century, which is pretty cool. It can be spoken or chanted, and it says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lachem min haaretz, amen. And that is translated, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth, amen. So it's really cool to think that we can say the same blessing that Jesus himself might have said. So again, we have green grass, and the grass would be green because of the rain around the time of the Passover. So basically this took place in springtime. Another possible reason we have a link to the Passover is that the crowd might have been assembled at the beginning of their pilgrimage down to up to Jerusalem for the feast. But why they would leave without any food, that would be be kind of problematic. So they put them in groups of 50s or 100s. The reason for that is a direct head count census was forbidden except in very limited circumstances, so having the folks gather in larger groups would be a way to estimate the size. If we include women and children, there could have easily have been 20,000 people here. So this is a huge crowd for one person to try and control. So these were fish that were photographed after being caught in the Middle East, and so the fish may have been something like these, or may have been something a lot smaller. If we read the Gospel of John sequentially, and we were in John chapter 5 several lessons ago, but back then Jesus spoke of Moses. And so I'll start with verse 45. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So there's a connection that John, the gospel writer, is making because Jesus does a Moses-like miracle. He provides bread, and while he does this while he's delivering a very Moses-like teaching from a mountain. So there's a clear connection to Jesus as Moses here. And when they'd eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. I guess they didn't want to keep the fish. Fish wouldn't keep, but the bread would keep. And so you see all 4 Gospels mention 12 baskets, and all 4 Gospels say it was 5,000 men. So we have 12 baskets. It appears to fit one for each apostle, disciple, and then they're over each of the 12 tribes. So one takeaway is that Jesus is, especially in the Gospel of John, he's communicating that Jesus is the Messiah for all Israel, not just for the tribe of Judah. The 12 baskets could also allude to 12 loaves of the temple. So there's the showbread, or the bread of presence, and so each Shabbat the priests had to put 12 new loaves, and that was also food for the priests a little bit. So could be that kind of connection there. Keener picks up on the fact that nothing is wasted, and his quote is, its provision is not to be taken for granted and squandered. He also notes that culturally, in that day, to have leftovers means that the host was more than adequate in providing for his guests. So therefore, Jesus is really the ultimate host, because the leftovers they collected were actually more than he started with. Now we move into the next section is that basically it's very short, but the prevention of the revolutionary purpose to proclaim Jesus king, as Robertson calls this section, or they want a political Messiah basically. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." And they're referring to Moses says, "A prophet like me will arise." Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So if our reading of the feeding occurring on the southeast side of the plain of Bethsaida is accurate, then the mountain Jesus prayed probably would have been like on the left side of the photo here, somewhere in this region here. So the people were very anxious to crown a political king, but that's not who Jesus was to be in his first coming. So there's things going on there. Jesus may have also had a pragmatic reason for avoiding this in addition to prophetic reasons. Basically, we remember that Herod Antipas had just killed John the Baptist, and then immediately after this, you have this huge crowd following someone they're proclaiming king. So that could have caused problems for Jesus. Tiberias was really not that far away, and so news of this potentially revolutionary event would have traveled very quickly. And we can also infer that maybe the zealots in the crowd were trying to stir up the multitude, taking it by force. But Jesus was very quick to defuse the situation. His hour had not yet come. And my thought was that lest we could be hard on the crowd, saying they just don't get it. But remember, Jesus had just compared himself to Moses, and Moses was a political leader who did miracles, and he did free his people from a tyrannical regime. So maybe let's not be so hard on them. It's easy for us to say they just don't get it, but in some respects, given the promises of the Messiah, it's really not that difficult to see their perspective and why they would have attempted to crown him. Now, taking him by force would be problematic because we cannot put Jesus in our image. Jesus, we have to conform to his image. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. He got into a boat, started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on water, and coming near the boat, they were frightened. So I think I've used this picture before, but it kind of gives a good representation of the wave. The very small lake, but then you can get some pretty sizable waves occurring. A couple lessons ago, I talked about how the winds come from the west and they form a vortex that can create these enormous waves. A couple of clarifications I need to make. The wind doesn't have to come from the west. There is another phenomenon where winds come from the southeast off of the Arabian desert, so you have these hot winds blowing, and if you're familiar with Southern California's infamous Santa Ana winds that change direction and cause fires and kind of havoc, it's kind of very similar to probably what was happening here. And so one reason we may be told it was in the spring was that if these are the winds, then it would have been very unusual to have these early in the year, because these are more of a June, July, August, September kind of phenomenon to get these hot winds in. The reason scholars think it's this is because they were blown off course and they ended up in Gennesaret, which is in the kind of the northwest corner of the sea. So the thought was the winds came from the southeast and blew them across the lake. But who knows? That could be speculation. The other thing is that it's wind. So he saw the wind. There doesn't, I think I said dark and stormy night. It doesn't necessarily have to be stormy. In fact, winds might make more sense in that it would catch fishermen off guard because you can't see them coming. Although Peter saw the wind here, interestingly enough. So either way, it doesn't necessarily imply thunder and lightning and rain. It could just be these massive windstorms that come up. So again, some speculate that the disciples weren't prepared for this because the waves don't usually happen and in the springtime, and so that could be a reason. This is kind of a funny sign. It's in the park area at Caesarea Philippi, and in that region, it's a beautiful area. You have a very small stream that actually flows into the Jordan River, and the purpose of the sign is stay on the path, don't cross the stream. But of course, in Israel, you can't be too careful, so it could be no walking on water here is kind of funny. We talked in previous lessons about the concept of trial by ordeal or a trial by water. And it's in the writings of several of the ancient peoples, and we see it in the Bible, particularly with Noah, and then again with Moses as a baby, where he's, the babies were supposed to be thrown in the Nile and drowned, but Moses survived. And then the children of Israel during the Exodus, they crossed the Red Sea on dry land. So these are all water ordeals, and the thought was the innocent would live through it, but then the guilty would drown. So the wicked of Noah's day drowned. The pursuing Egyptian army drowned. So it's a judgment. And we talked about that a few lessons back. So another way to look at this is that in this miracle of walking on water, he is, of course, demonstrating his power over nature, but he's also demonstrating his righteousness by demonstrating power over the water. He didn't fall. He didn't drown. He conquered it. And so it really foreshadows Jesus' resurrection, which we actually symbolize today by baptism, right? When we are brought up out of the water, that symbolizes Jesus' resurrection and kind of conquering what, normally people would drown in if they were submerged in water, but we're demonstrating our righteousness. Jesus, of course, is just not bound by natural restrictions, is the main takeaway. I'll switch over to Matthew's version because he is the only one that records Peter's escapades here. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, walked on water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out to his hand and took a hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And you can imagine they're just kind of terrified of all this. The three Gospels each note, "It is I." Keener notes that this could be also be understood to mean "I am," and translated that way. So basically, Jesus is the "I am" of the Bible, of the Old Testament. He's the same. So righteous mortals may be able to part waters, but only God can walk upon them, right? In Genesis 1, we see that the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And then in Job 8, it says that God trampled the waters of the sea. So we have this picture of God who can conquer gravity and conquer natural forces by walking on the water here. So this is kind of a funny reenactment of the scene that Dr. Bolin took, and he is quick to say there's no Photoshop involved. There must be a rock or something that the person is standing on. But anyway, it's a great picture of Peter drowning and then Jesus saving him. Dan Stolbarger, my friend, likes to imagine. Last time we were in Israel, he told this kind of funny story that he thought of. He likes to imagine the disciples maybe sitting around a campfire up in heaven, reminiscing about the good old days. And then invariably, a couple of them will start to razz Peter for all of his failures and missteps. And hey, remember that time you got out and Jesus had to rescue you and all that. And then Dan imagines Peter kind of returning fire, saying, "Yeah, that was bad. But tell me, how did it go when you walked on water?" "Oh, that's right. You never even got out of the boat." So I think there's a lesson in both. Certainly, when it says it says Peter saw the wind and began to sink. So the old saying is true. When he stepped out in faith, he was fine until he took his eyes off Jesus, and so that's an application there. But there's also there's a time for caution and prudence. There's probably a time to stay in the boat and ride out the storm, but there's also a time to risk, and there's also a time to step out and be bold, even if it means we fail. So let's not lose sight of the fact that for a moment anyway, Peter did walk on water. He defied the normal laws of nature, and he did the miracle himself. Peter will also be kind of ahead of the group when we get to Caesarea Philippi in a few weeks, with his great confession of faith in Matthew 16, and then he will again sink the night of Jesus' arrest when he denies Jesus. So, but always when he falls, Jesus is there with a hand that restores him. And note that Matthew records that here you have just kind of in the picture you have kind of reaching out a hand and Peter reaching up. Matthew records it was all Jesus. Jesus grabbed him and pulled him back. So that's a kind of a great thought as well. Um, we may not even realize that we're drowning. We don't even, as men, we tend not to even say, Lord, save me. We more often say, Lord, I got this. But Jesus will reach out and grab us when he needs to. Then continuing in John, so after this, John records immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going, and then the other two Gospels record it as the boat came to land at Gennesaret. Then John continues, on the next day, the crowd that remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had only been one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Other boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread, and after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boat and went to Capernaum seeking Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? So this is a picture of the plain of Gennesaret, and again, it's on the northwest corner of the sea, and so they would have the crowd would have been over in this area in Bethsaida, and then the disciples ended up here, and then they all kind of converge on the area of Capernaum, which is kind of in this area here. So the plain runs northwest along the sea. Again, we don't exactly know where Jesus landed. A lot of scholars read this as the storm, which would have come from the southeast here, would have come through and blown them off course. So they're probably heading to Capernaum, but then ended up off to the west here in Gennesaret. John's use of immediately is curious. So is John saying this is what happened next, or is there a hint of some interdimensional instantaneous transport? So we don't know. A lot of scholars speculate. Some say yes, some say no. So when they landed at Gennesaret, the Matthew and Mark record some miracles and healings there, and then the people just wanted to only touch the tassel of his cloak. And we talked about this with the woman with the issue of blood, how she just wanted to reach out and touch the hem of his garment and were healed. So we won't visit it here, but this is a picture of that, the corner, the tassels. So picture of Capernaum. So we kind of always in Galilee, we kind of all roads lead back to Capernaum. So the disciples make their way from Gennesaret, which is off to the west, back to Capernaum, and then the crowd who was off in this area here tracks him down, and then the synagogue, which is right here, will be where the rest of John chapter 6 takes place, and Jesus will give the I am the bread of life, that discourse, and he will give a very difficult teaching. Even to this day, it's a hard teaching to hear, but we'll pick that up next time. So intermingled with the disciples' storm and being thrown off course and the boat journeys, we have this little side story about the masses trying to triangulate Jesus' position in order to track him down, right? We saw the disciples leave, we didn't see him leave, but yet somehow he's not here, and he wasn't on that boat, and he's not on this boat. So in a sense, this is good, as there's a saying around Christmas that wise men still seek him. So the crowd knew that at some level Jesus was someone worth pursuing. But the flip side, as I said in the opening, Jesus is not the Messiah you're looking for. If you're looking for a king, if you're looking for a political ruler, this time around, that's not what Jesus' role is. And again, as Keener puts it, they wanted free food and political deliverance. They wanted another Moses. So this, again, the healing, the feeding of the 5,000, and then this desire to make a political king is going to result in this sermon that takes place in the remainder of John, where Jesus is going to go into really the first time publicly detail about his mission to sacrifice himself. So we'll note that the message is not seeker friendly. In fact, it will shock and stun the audience. And in verse 60, his disciples will say, "This is the hard teaching. Who can follow it?" And then verse 66, we'll see that as a result of the sermon, many disciples left. So our goal is not to be the disciple that leaves. Our goal is to be the disciple that, to whom shall we go? We stay at Jesus' feet, and we have to make ourselves conform to Jesus' image and not have Jesus cast in our image. So the takeaway then is Jesus is obviously worth pursuing, but we have to accept them on his terms and not ours. So fasten your seatbelt, and we will prepare for this hard teaching in part 2. So an application might be for us to connect the dots, and as we further attempt to associate the power of the resurrection and what that means for us with these events here. So Schlegel writes, the close association of the feeding of the 5,000 chronologically to walking on water suggests an association of meeting. If the feeding of the 5,000 is a symbol of Jesus' death, walking on water symbolizes his resurrection to a body not limited to what we consider the normal laws of physics. The parallels in attitude and language between the walking on water incident with a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus also suggest that the walking on water was a symbol of Jesus' resurrection. And then as we talked about earlier, that the conquering of the water trial by proving that you're righteous and that he was righteous and is superior. So a lot to take in, and we have a lot more coming. So again, hold on tight, and we will continue with Lesson 23, Part 2 next time, where we will close out John chapter 6.